Before history was written, it was fought in blood. This is echoes of war. In the early hours before dawn, when the world still believes it is safe in sleep, war moves differently. It does not knock. It does not warn. It does not wait. It strikes like lightning. In 1939, Europe was a continent holding its breath. The scars of the First World War still cut across maps and memories, but many leaders convinced themselves that another great conflict could be avoided. Agreements were signed, promises were made, speeches spoke of peace, of diplomacy, of stability. But behind closed doors, a new kind of war was being prepared. Not the slow, grinding trench warfare of the past, but something faster, sharper, designed not to bleed an enemy over years, but to shatter them in weeks. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg. Lightning war. It was not just a tactic, it was a philosophy of destruction built for the modern age. Instead of long lines of infantry slowly advancing under artillery fire, Blitzkrieg relied on speed, surprise, and coordination. Tanks would punch through weak points in enemy defenses. Aircraft would roar overhead, striking roads, bridges, and communication centers. Motorized infantry would follow, flooding through the gaps before defenders could regroup. The goal was not simply to win battles, it was to break a nation's ability to think, to react, to resist. And the first nation to feel the full force of this storm was Poland. On September 1st, 1939, as morning light crept across the Polish countryside, the ground began to tremble. Along the border, German artillery opened fire. Shells screamed through the air, crashing into defensive positions, rail lines, and towns still half asleep. Then came the planes. Stuka dive bombers appeared in the sky, their engines howling as they plunged toward their targets. Sirens mounted on their wings created a terrifying wail, a sound designed not just to destroy buildings, but to break nerves. Bombs fell on airfields, bridges, and columns of troops scrambling to respond. Below, columns of German tanks rolled forward. These were not the slow, unreliable machines of the First World War. These were fast, coordinated, supported by radios that allowed commanders to adjust plans in real time. They did not stop to fight every pocket of resistance. They bypassed strongholds, leaving them isolated, while racing deeper into Polish territory. Polish forces fought back with courage, but they were unprepared for this kind of war. Many units still relied on horses for transport. Communications were slower. Defensive plans assumed a more traditional conflict, with time to reposition and respond. Blitzkrieg gave them no time. Within days, German forces had advanced far beyond what anyone thought possible. Cities were bombed, roads filled with civilians fleeing east, carrying what little they could. Columns of refugees mixed with retreating soldiers, creating scenes of confusion and desperation. Then, from the east, another blow fell. The Soviet Union invaded Poland as well, under a secret agreement with Germany to divide the country between them. Poland, attacked from two sides, was crushed in weeks. To the world, it was a shock. To Hitler and his generals, it was proof. Lightning war worked, but the true test would come in the West. France and Britain declared war on Germany after the invasion of Poland. But for months, little happened on the ground. It was a strange period, sometimes called the phony war. Soldiers dug in. Armies waited. Many hoped that perhaps the worst had already passed. They were wrong. In May 1940, the storm broke again. The French had prepared for war based on the memory of 1914. Along their border with Germany stood the Maginot Line, a chain of massive fortifications designed to stop a direct assault. Concrete bunkers, underground railways, heavy guns. It was a wall built from the lessons of the last war. But Blitzkrieg was designed to ignore walls. Instead of attacking the strongest defenses head-on, German forces struck through the Ardennes forest, a region many believed was too difficult for large armies to cross quickly. Dense woods, narrow roads, and rough terrain were thought to be natural barriers. German tank columns proved otherwise. Moving with astonishing speed, they pushed through the forest, surprising French and British planners. While Allied forces advanced into Belgium, expecting the main attack there, German armor surged behind them, slicing toward the English Channel. It was a maneuver of breathtaking boldness. Within days, Allied armies found themselves trapped. British and French troops were cut off near the coast, their supply lines severed, German forces closing in from multiple directions. The world watched as hundreds of thousands of soldiers crowded the beaches of Dunkirk, waiting under constant air attack. It looked like the end of Britain's army, but in one of the most dramatic evacuations in history, naval vessels and civilian boats crossed the Channel, rescuing over 300,000 men. It was a retreat, a desperate escape, but it saved the core of Britain's fighting force. France, however, was left exposed. German units drove south, bypassing defenses, sowing confusion. Communication lines collapsed. Refugees flooded the roads, clogging military movements. Town after town fell. The speed of the advance shattered morale. In June 1940, France surrendered. In just 6 weeks, one of Europe's great military powers had been defeated. To many observers, it seemed unstoppable. Blitzkrieg had rewritten the rules of war. Armies that had prepared for another slow, grinding conflict found themselves overwhelmed by a style of fighting that moved faster than their ability to adapt. But lightning has limits. Speed depends on supply, fuel, spare parts, coordination. And as the war expanded, the distances grew longer, the resistance stronger. In 1941, Hitler turned east. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was the largest military assault in history. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, endless columns of trucks and artillery crossed the border in June. Once again, Blitzkrieg led the way. Soviet forces near the frontier were encircled and destroyed in massive pockets. Entire armies vanished. Cities fell in rapid succession. German commanders believed victory might come before winter. But the Soviet Union was not Poland. It was not France. It was vast. As German forces drove deeper, their supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of poor roads. Vehicles broke down, fuel struggled to reach the front. The Red Army, though battered, did not collapse. It retreated, regrouped, and counterattacked. Then came the winter. Temperatures plunged, engines froze, soldiers lacked proper clothing. The same speed that had brought early victories now worked against the invaders. Blitzkrieg had been designed for rapid, decisive campaigns, not endless, grinding battles across frozen plains. In places like Moscow and later Stalingrad, the war slowed into brutal close-quarters fighting. The lightning strike became a war of attrition, the very kind Germany had hoped to avoid. Blitzkrieg had stunned the world, but it could not win a war alone. Still, its early successes had changed everything. Nations scrambled to adapt. Armies reorganized around armored divisions and air support. Communication and mobility became central to military planning. The lightning had shown what modern war could be. It was not just about firepower. It was about tempo, about collapsing an enemy's decision-making before they could respond, about turning shock into a weapon, but it also revealed a darker truth. Speed can magnify destruction just as easily as it magnifies victory. Civilians found themselves on the front lines as cities were bombed and roads turned into rivers of refugees. The line between soldier and civilian blurred in the chaos of rapid invasion. Blitzkrieg was efficient, and efficiency in war can be terrifying. By the later years of the conflict, Germany would find itself on the defensive, facing enemies who had learned from its methods and surpassed its industrial strength. The lightning that once seemed unstoppable would flicker, then fade. But in those early years, in Poland, in France, across the Low Countries, Blitzkrieg reshaped the battlefield and shattered illusions about how the next war would be fought. It showed that the future of war would move fast. That surprise could be as deadly as numbers. That a nation could fall not just from lack of courage, but from the shock of being unprepared for a new kind of storm. And it left a lesson that echoes still. When the world believes it has learned from the last war, the next one often arrives in a form no one expects. The battlefield grows silent, but history never does. The men inside the tanks did not see themselves as part of history. They saw dust, vibration, heat, the metallic taste of fear sitting quietly in the back of the throat. Inside a Panzer, the world was reduced to narrow vision slits and the crackling voice of a commander in their headphones. Orders came fast, directions changed quickly, left flank collapsing, bridge secured, resistance ahead, move, always move. Blitzkrieg depended on momentum, and momentum depended on men who could keep going even when exhaustion began to blur their thoughts. Crews slept in short, broken moments beside their machines. Mechanics worked through the night, replacing tracks, patching engines, keeping the armored spearheads alive. Behind them came the motorized infantry, soldiers in trucks and half-tracks, moving far faster than armies of the past ever could. They were not meant to lead. They were meant to flood through the breaches, to occupy towns before defenders could regroup, to turn breakthroughs into collapse. Speed became a weapon. Polish units often received reports of German forces in one sector, only to learn hours later that tanks had already appeared miles behind them. Defensive lines became meaningless when the enemy did not stop to fight them directly. Encirclement followed. Entire formations found themselves surrounded, cut off from supplies, communications shattered. Some fought on, isolated and doomed. Others surrendered when ammunition ran dry and no help came. But Blitzkrieg was not just steel and engines, it was sound. The scream of Stuka sirens became one of the most feared noises of the war. Civilians learned to recognize it instantly, that rising mechanical wail that meant bombs were seconds away. Even hardened soldiers felt their nerves fray under repeated air attacks. Sleep became impossible. Every distant engine could mean death from above. Psychological shock was part of the design. The German High Command understood something many had underestimated. Modern war would not be fought only on battlefields. It would be fought in minds. Confusion, fear, and disorientation could spread faster than bullets. Radio played a role too. German units communicated constantly, adjusting movements in real time. Polish forces, with fewer radios and more rigid command structures, often acted on outdated information. By the time orders arrived, the situation had already changed. Blitzkrieg thrived in that gap between reality and awareness. And as Poland burned, the world watched with a mixture of horror and disbelief. In Britain and France, leaders realized that the war they had prepared for no longer existed. Yet old habits and old assumptions are hard to abandon. Defensive strategies still focused on holding lines, on preparing for slow advances. But lightning does not respect lines drawn on maps. When Germany turned west in 1940, the tempo increased. Belgium and the Netherlands fell with shocking speed. Airborne troops captured key bridges and fortifications, opening paths for advancing armor. Paratroopers, once considered experimental, now seized critical positions, in daring operations that stunned defenders. Again, the message was clear: nowhere was truly safe. French commanders struggled to understand where the main blow would fall. Reports came in from everywhere at once: tanks here, bombers there, breakthroughs in unexpected sectors. The pace of events overwhelmed traditional command systems. Meanwhile, German armored columns pushed relentlessly forward, often advancing faster than their own supply officers believed possible. Risk was part of the plan. Boldness compensated for vulnerability. And at the heart of it all was a dangerous confidence. Early victories reinforced the belief that Blitzkrieg was unstoppable, that speed and aggression could solve any problem. This confidence fueled even more ambitious operations. But confidence can become overreach. In Russia, distances swallowed momentum. Roads turned to mud during seasonal rains, trapping vehicles in endless fields of sludge. Dust in summer clogged engines and lungs alike. Then winter froze everything solid. The lightning began to flicker, yet even as Blitzkrieg lost its edge in the east, its legacy spread. Other nations studied it carefully. The Allies adapted, building their own armored formations, improving air-ground coordination, and learning to respond faster. By the time they returned to Western Europe in 1944, they brought a version of lightning back with them. Still, the early years of Blitzkrieg remained unique, a moment when one side had mastered a new way of war before others understood how to stop it. For civilians caught in its path, it felt like the end of the world, arriving without warning. One day there was peace, routine, normal life. The next, columns of foreign tanks rolled through town squares while aircraft droned overhead. Occupation followed invasion. Blitzkrieg opened the door. What came after was years of control, resistance, collaboration, and suffering that reshaped entire societies. But on the battlefield itself, the image endured. Fast-moving armor under dark skies, radios crackling, commanders gambling everything on speed. Lightning is powerful, but it is also brief. In the end, Blitzkrieg could win battles with terrifying efficiency, but it could not replace industry, resources, or time. As Germany's enemies mobilized their vast production and manpower, the early advantage faded. The war became the long, grinding struggle Blitzkrieg had been designed to avoid, yet its impact never disappeared. Modern militaries still study those campaigns. The principles of rapid maneuver, combined arms coordination, and shock action remain central to warfare today. Technology has changed, weapons have evolved, but the idea of overwhelming an enemy before they can react, that is Blitzkrieg's enduring echo. It was the sound of engines at dawn, the scream of diving aircraft, the collapse of certainty, a reminder that war does not stand still, that each generation prepares for the last conflict while the next one waits in a different form. And when it comes fast. The battlefield grows silent, but history never does.